it's the same old story. One as old as time, as cliched as it gets. And it started out like every other bloody story. Bitten by the bug at a young age, an irrepressible urge to just drive, to race, to dare to dream of becoming a Formula One driver. That is how it all started for Daniel Ricciardo. Although where he would end up today, the influence that he would have in and around the sport, I'm not sure that even he could have ever have known. His first ventures into racing were in go-karts at Wanneroo, mere yards away from the racetrack where his father had raced in sedans before him. It was here then, in the home of racing in Western Australia, that his story would start. Although, while I can tell you about the story that's about to come, I don't know if I can tell you what it is about Italian Australians and racing. Ricciardo, Piastri, D'Alberto, alas, you now know what to look for when searching for that next talent out of Kangaroo Land. His karting career wasn't littered with achievements, so to speak. A CRK trophy here, a club championship there, but if you were to trawl through what's on paper, there wasn't much of anything to suggest that Daniel Ricciardo was going to be God's gift to motor racing. Nevertheless, in 2005, he would leave the karting world of cracked ribs behind for the sunny shores of car racing. He would compete in the Western Australia Formula Ford Championship, driving a 15-year-old Van Diemen chassis, which doesn't sound ideal, but there were plenty of other drivers on that grid who were driving the exact same chassis, and initially, those drivers were beating him. You might be able to chalk that up to experience, and that argument does have some validity, because as the year progressed, he began to ascend up the spectrum, and he was starting to win, a trait that would follow him for the remainder of his career. Although in order to get said career, Formula Ford in WA can only get you so far, and so this young fresh-faced kid, still looking like a casting for a young Adam Sandler, headed over to Asia to race in Formula BMW. It was a good experience, picking up 2 wins in Thailand and finishing 3rd in the championship. Good shit to have under his belt before taking up another year of racing, and this time he would head to the motherland, Italia. He would run around that year with RP Motorsport. It wasn't exactly the bee's knees of motor racing teams, especially not compared to Epsilon, who had virtually all the Red Bull Juniors in their squad. That team had all the resources that they needed, and they were the benchmark. And yet, Ricciardo was pestering them, just kept hounding them the entire year, even if he didn't even get a podium the whole season, finishing the championship in 6th overall. Yeah, that doesn't sound spellbinding, but for those actually watching, it was like, whoa, okay, this guy's kinda good. And one of those watching was a dude who was about to have a major influence on his entire career. Darth Marko. It was around about this time that the Red Bull Junior team stopped being comprised entirely of Austrians, although not willing to stray too far from the path, an Australian seemed close enough, and this guy seemed the goods. So at the end of 2007, Marko approached the Ricciardos to ask, hey, do you guys want to not have to pay for racing anymore? I mean, we can do that, and we'll put Danny up in the best teams with the best engineers as well. How's that all sound? I mean, who could ever possibly turn something like that down? Now armed with good machinery, Ricciardo began to spread his wings. He won the Western European Formula Renault Championship and came within an inch of beating Valtteri Bottas for the Euro Cup title too. He would back this up the next year by winning the title in the British F3 Championship. The momentum was building for him. The snowball was getting bigger. People were beginning to see that this guy was backing himself up all of the time. There was some talk of Brendan Hartley and whether or not he was going to be the next Red Bull Junior to make that step up to Formula One. But now the tide was turning. The narrative was beginning to swing. Now this guy was the talk of the town. Hartley? Well, he was yesterday's news, but for the time being, Red Bull's vacancies in Formula One were pretty well sorted out. The junior team, Toro Rosso, already had Sebastian Buemi and Jaime El Jaswari in there, so everyone else was just gonna have to wait. In the meantime, Ricciardo was thrown into the World Series by Renault series that was run by Renault and was a series. At this time, this was considered the best championship to judge if someone was any good or not. Well, at least it was better regarded than GP2 was. I mean, my brother in Christ, the champion that year was Pastor Maldonado. Normally, series rookies don't win the championship. Normally, it does take time to wrap your head around a car that has more power than a South American dictator, but Daniel Ricciardo isn't normally. Heading into the last race of the season, Ricciardo had won 4 races and was the joint championship leader with recently jettisoned Red Bull Jr. Michael Alamy. In a basic sense, this was a winner-takes-all scenario, and whoever finished higher in that final race would be the champion. And in third place, ahead of Alamy, was Ricciardo, until a couple laps to go when Alamy slid past and took the title away from Danny Ric. Despite this excruciating defeat, watching his title hopes fade off into the mist, it did nothing to hurt his Formula One chances. Now that Brendan Hartley was rightfully kicked to the curb, Ricciardo would be kept busy with Formula One reserve driver roles at Red Bull and Toro Rosso. His 2011 season comprised of another campaign in the World Series, but these plans would hit a snag. Before the first round of the championship, Ricciardo was kidnapped by Canadian pirates whilst mountain climbing in Saskatchewan and had to be subbed for that round by Lewis Williamson. When he returned for round 2, the results were they were okay, I guess. Sure, he would bag a win on the streets of Monaco, but was largely forced that year to be the bridesmaid in the races. Meanwhile, fellow Red Bull Jr. Jean-Eric Vergne was in a hard-fought battle for the title with yet another former Red Bull Jr. in Robert Wickens. Although, given how good Wickens was, why Marco ever cut that guy loose is beyond me. But then you remember that Marco almost certainly judges his drivers' performances based on their Wikipedia articles, so I guess I'll just go f myself. Nevertheless, he did see merit in what Ricciardo was doing. Anyone watching knew it, even if that one win in Monaco was all that he had for that year. With only one round to go in that year's World Series, Marco phoned Ricciardo and told him, "Don't bother, you're not racing in the World Series anymore. Instead, I'm gonna send you to HRT for the rest of the year." For someone like Ricciardo, a prospective Australian racing driver, to hear the words, "You're going to race for HRT," the initial response would have been, HRT, the best V8 supercar team in the land? Me drive for them? With all their resources, history, success, illegal engines, traction control? I wouldn't mind that. Give me all of that. Of course, that wasn't the HRT that Marco was referring to. He meant this HRT. A Formula One seat certainly sounds better than a V8 supercar one, but having to race for HRT, the Hispania racing team, is a hell that I wouldn't even subject onto my own worst enemy. They had a car that, earlier that year, couldn't even qualify for the race. To be pleased to drive for them is akin to voluntary castration. So why then did Marco press gang him into the team, especially given that there were no apparent Red Bull ties in sight? Well, ever desperate in need of money, and keen to kick at least one of their drivers to the curb, HRT were only too happy to oblige. That is the power of sponsors. Wanna see mine? Yeah, I know. There's a lot here you've probably heard already, but with our dependence online increasing every day, we need our stuff to be protected. We'd like to think that our information is safe, but with trust online being at an all-time low, you are going to need proper security. And I'm guessing you know what Surfshark is all about. In case you don't know, it's a VPN service that protects your information by encrypting all the data that you send through the internet, thereby protecting it and keeping any of life's more interesting creatures from getting at it. But hey, you're looking for something else? You want a little bit extra? Are you, for argument's sake, sick of having your content restricted based on your location? Well, join the club. Or do you? Because with Surfshark, you can solve that problem by simply changing your location, at least virtually. Not only is this good for people who want to keep up with their favorite shows, but it can also be a vital tool for those who live in countries that, for whatever reason, view the concept of freedom in the same vein as witchcraft. It ain't quite teleportation, but it is about as close as we're gonna get right now. So, secure your privacy with Surfshark. Type in the link on the screen right now, or click it in the description to get an extra 4 months free with your subscription, fully protecting yourself when all said and done for something like a couple of bucks a month. And remember, it's 4 free months and a 30-day money-back guarantee as well. So what the bloody hell are you waiting for? Okay, back to the show. So the HRT was the antithesis of a shitbox, but of course, even the worst Formula One car of all time would still be amazing compared to anything you've ever driven before. Ricciardo said that the F111 was actually pretty good, which bless him. But of course, there are 2 cars in each team. Even if your car's crap, you still have a teammate to compete against. He would make his Formula One debut at Silverstone, driving alongside Antonio Liuzzi. Danny Ric did impress in the Young Drivers Test for Red Bull a few months ago, but this was different. This was a full-blown race weekend, driving for a team that was funded by food stamps, a car that had to be started using a teaspoon, and run by a consortium of people who had no business running a food stall at a county fair. Never mind a Formula One team, and the lack of experience kind of showed. showed. He was destroyed by Liuzzi that weekend, being half a second off in qualifying and finishing a lap behind him in the race. He also developed color blindness whenever the marshals started to wave blue flags at him, but at the very least, all of this was an improvement over the man that he had replaced, Narain Karthikeyan. Not that that's a feat worth writing home about. As the year drew on, Danny began to pick up the pace. Then he started to out-qualify Tonio. He then started to out-race Tonio. No one in the history of the goddamn galaxy was ever going to make the HRT work, but it was clear nonetheless how much he was progressing, as well as his potential in terms of speed. Something else that people picked up on was his personality. It doesn't make a driver go faster, but it certainly makes them more marketable. There's a lot of fakeness and blandness inside the European paddock, so to have someone like Danny with his infectious smile, fun personality, and pure racer mentality was just refreshing to see. It also helped contribute somewhat to his self-bestowed nickname, Honey Badger. Outside the car, he's a cool dude who you would want to hang with. On the track, however, motherfucker was there to steal your honey. And your honey. Come the end of the season, Marco had seen enough, and if his mind wasn't made up already, he decided then and there that Bueme and Al Jaswari were gonna be sent to the glue factory, and in their place, yeah, you guessed it. Where better to score your first F1 points than at home? Coming across the line in 9th place, Ricciardo drew first blood in the teammate war at Toro Rosso and created a memory that would last forever, especially given Albert Park's aptitude for giving local drivers all the luck until said drivers start getting too big for their britches. He continued to impress all throughout that year, pulling his own polar bear in Arlington, Texas moments. There were some genuinely stirring drives from this guy, but he would be beaten in the overall standings that year by teammate Jean-Eric Vergne. Danny Ric never achieved a placing higher than 9th in all 20 races that season. Vergne, meanwhile, had achieved 8th 4 times. It was the first year for the both of them, at least full-time. Uncharted waters and all that stuff, so a second year together would be a more accurate representation perhaps. They would be retained for 2013, but this time they had a carrot dangled in front of them. F1's resident Wolverine, Mark Webber, would be retiring at the end of 2013, thus leaving the door ajar for a spot on the main Red Bull team, which had proven to be the dominant force of the last few years. To go to this team guarantees you a shot of winning, of driving a car that can prove to the world just how good you are. For Vergne and Ricciardo, this year then would mean everything. Vergne put on some good performances, achieving a 6th place in Montreal, the highest placing for a Toro Rosso car that year, but Rick just seemed to have an extra gear, finishing in the points far more frequently and placing ahead of Vergne in the standings. He clearly did look like the better dude in that team, and the Red Bull hierarchy thought so too. By early September, it was confirmed that Ricciardo would be the one to replace Webber at Red Bull for 2014. So the easy part, if you can call it that, was over. Now he was faced with a task that was sure to force a mass exodus of crap from one Spectre. He had just become the teammate of Sebastian Vettel, the 4-time reigning world champion, a man who had been scarily dominant from the start to the end of this era of Formula One, someone who, leading into the start of 2014, had won the previous 9 races in a row. He was the big dog in the yard now, but, you know, he wasn't exactly universally popular. Thanks to team order shenanigans the previous year, Vettel was not very well liked in Australia. He was seen to have screwed over Webber, stabbed him in the back, multi-21 and all that jazz. Now he's got another Australian for a teammate. Was he gonna screw him over as well? The locals were hoping for his downfall, and in qualifying, they got it. Seb failed to get into Q3 for the first Grand Prix of this new era of F1. But what made it even more sweet for the 100,000 plus that turned up that weekend was what happened next. Ricciardo did make it into Q3. He was fast in the lead up to it, and as the seconds whittled down in that session, Ricciardo went fastest. The crowd went wild, rising to their feet, babies being flung in the air. The nation stood aghast as one of their own was about to Here comes Lewis.
Too soon, Junior.
Alas, it was not to be, but straight out of the gate, to beat Seb in qualifying like this, to put his car on the front row in less than ideal conditions, all of that justified Red Bull's faith in the kid, and come race day, he was holding his own. As cars all around him fell apart, he kept that Red Bull in 2nd place, all the way to the flag, and became the first Australian to claim a podium in their home Formula One Grand Prix. Jubilation all across the landscape. The crowd had found their new hero, at least for a couple of seconds. Not long after getting everyone's hopes up, Ricciardo was disqualified from the race after having been found to be in breach of fuel flow regulations. This, along with a tricky weekend in Malaysia, was a double gut punch for him. And maybe it was suggestion that Albert Park was just a one-off, that Seb had rediscovered his form and that now this was actually where the form lay. If that were the case, then the rest of the season made no sense. As fast as the Mercedes were, reliability wasn't exactly their forte that year. During the Canadian Grand Prix, both drivers were battling car problems. Hamilton went out with brake issues. Rosberg had his own problems, but was still in the lead. That was until, with a handful of laps to go, his mirrors became full of Red Bull. He had just made an audacious move on Checo to get up into second place. But when it came to Nico, he wouldn't need such acrobatics. And with this, Daniel Ricciardo cruised home to take his first career win, and the fourth Australian in history to win a race in Formula 1 after Brabham, Jones and Webberine. It was an awesome performance, and it was only the beginning. He won again in Hungary and then in Belgium. It wasn't just the fact that he won, it was the way in which he would do it. He was aggressive, but in a good way, never really too excessive, and certainly never unfair. The last of the late breakers, sometimes admittedly a little too late, but a proper racer nonetheless. And thanks to all this gusto, he was still in with a mathematical chance of winning the World Championship, thanks in part to his amazing form, and thanks in part to Bernie Ecclestone's completely rancid idea of having double points for the final round in Abu Dhabi. Ultimately, the evil empire was just too much to overcome, and he was forced to settle for third in the championship. But still, when you look back and you see what he did and the stuff that he achieved, what a freaking year. With Seb running off to join Ferrari for 2015, this left Danny Ric as the guy at Red Bull. Now paired with Daniel Kvyat, this was bound to be the year where he could use his momentum and experience to take Red Bull back to the promised land. But instead, the team would hit a rut. The Renault engines were lacking power as well as a will to live, and thus left the team winless for the first time since 2008. He had some good performances, including challenging for the win in Singapore in a car that had no freaking right to win. But when the dust settled, there were no wins, no pole positions, and had actually finished behind Kvyat in the overall standings. Was that a fair reflection of their performances that year? No, not really. Doesn't matter decades later when YouTubers try and tell your life story? I mean, it was a relatively tumultuous time for Red Bull. They weren't bad, so to speak, but they just couldn't muster a fight against Mercedes or even Ferrari in that time. Over the next couple of years, Rick did pick up a couple of wins, and some pretty f***ing good ones at that. He was still the guy, so to speak, but in that time, he had a new teammate in the form of Max Verstappen. Max was still young, he was still raw, but holy jumping shitballs, he was unbelievably fast from day one. To have your new teammate, who is still very much a teenager, win his first race with the team over 40 seconds up the road from you is a bitter pill to swallow. Never mind the differing strategies that almost certainly cost Ricciardo. People only ever remember who crossed the line first that day, and it wasn't him. By 2018, Danny was really hitting his stride. Not only was his place in Formula 1 beyond question, but if he were to leave here tomorrow, he would arguably be the best free agent that money could buy. He won in Shanghai with an assertive drive, whilst others around him faltered. One of those dudes that faltered was Max. He may have been fast back then, but he was also as crazy as a rainbow trout in a car wash. The pressure was getting to him, and it was clearly showing, even if he wouldn't admit it. For now, however, this didn't matter a hell of a lot to Ricciardo. Winning the teammate battle is always a good thing. Doesn't really matter how you do it. And for now, Daniel was still on top. And generally, this partnership was a harmonious one. Hardly any animosity whatsoever. But there were moments where things got strained. At the next round in Baku, Daniel and Max raced hard for position. Honey Badger would range up behind and even occasionally pass on the front straight, but Max would just repass again. This back and forth continued for a few more laps. For us viewers, this was great. Behind the wheel, however, Daniel was gritting his teeth. Frustration was building. He knew he needed to get past, but how is he going to do it? Max was withstanding all the pressure right now. As you exhaust your options, you start committing yourself that little bit more, breaking deeper than you would think you would dare. And on lap 40, the inevitable happened. Blame for this incident was hotly debated. Some said that Daniel just straight up rammed into Max's gearbox. Others say that Max moved under brakes and left Ricciardo, who was already committed at that point, with nowhere to go. Whatever the case, it was wholly unnecessary in a time where Red Bull would need every point that they could take, and both were made to apologize to the whole team after these gymnastics, especially so when the Renault engines that they had at the time were being, to put it nicely, overwhelmingly French. Car failures in a multitude of events that year for both drivers severely hurt their weekends and their championship charge. To be totally fair, not all of these car failures were down to those rat poison powered pencil sharpener powertrains, but of the two drivers, Daniel did seem to be the most affected. That smile of his was starting to wane. Monaco was a place of bitter memories for Ricciardo. Just 2 years before, he was leading the race, en route to almost certain victory. Then he came in for his pit stop, only to find that his pit crew were mid-game in a spout of musical chairs. Once they snapped out of it, gave him his tires and sent him on his way, the race was destroyed and lost. The feeling of euphoria of driving around this paragon of one-lap magic was perhaps outweighed by the shadow of a lost win that would have cemented his place as a made man in the sport. There's always a chance for redemption though, and it did seem that way in 2018. In qualifying that year, he was just in a class of one, while Max slammed his car into the barriers and would start last. Danny Ric was the only driver to dip into the 1-minute 10s and would start from pole. He was untouchable here, and he was a dude who made all mistakes. The race was bound to be his, and after leading into Sainte-Devote, we all just kicked back for another Monaco Grand Prix where, once again, nothing would happen in the race, just a cruisy win for whomever was leading.
Losing power.
No, not this again. Not now. This Renault power unit is once again gonna its undies, right when it's about to be gifted its second win of the season when it has no right to, against the might of the Merc and Ferrari PUs. When they're on the ropes, now is the time where your Maginot line falls down. The issue with the MG UK was costing him around 160 horsepower. With 50 odd laps to go, this radio message spelled doom. Vettel in the Ferrari got within DRS range. On any other track, Daniel would have been cooked. The advantage that he had was that this was Monaco, the hardest track by far to pass on, but you can still pass here nonetheless. With the ultimatum of Red Bull being keep driving until it blows up, the challenge was on. Seb got closer and closer. We were all just waiting for that lunge at the no longer Nouvelle chicane. He'd back off on occasion to cool the tires before attacking again. Eventually, however, there was 10 laps to go, then 5, then 4. The gap to Seb was growing wider. Lap 78 came by. The leader crossed the line. No one could believe what the hell they just witnessed. This was a Herculean effort from Honey Badger. It wasn't just that he was down on a bit of power, it was how he managed the situation, as well as the freaking 4-time world champion that was breathing down his neck like a redditor at Comic-Con. Christian Horner, a rare one for intellectual comments, described Rick's drive as unbelievable. That is right up there with what Schumacher did. Some may call that blasphemous, but either way, no one can deny that not just any old F1 driver can pull off drives like that. This is what cements legacies in the sport. This is the drive of a dude who deserves to be there. The demons of 2 years ago were well and truly buried. He can now let all of that go, or he was now truly on top of the world. But of course, it wouldn't last long. The lack of reliability was killing his run, and it was killing his championship. The normally composed Honey Badger was starting to lose his cool. What's more, Max was now starting to recover from that rancid start of his, and was really hitting his stride. The pendulum was beginning to swing. Results-wise, Max was starting to leave Danny Ric behind. Were the team as a whole beginning to favor Max? I mean, draw your own conclusions on that one, because I don't want to open that can of worms on myself. One thing for certain was that he didn't like the prospect of Honda coming to Red Bull, because at that time, Honda PUs had a tendency to blow themselves up even in the blueprint stages. But either way, he was in a position where he could name his price. He was as marketable as he was fast. He was a commodity, especially so given the emergence of Netflix show Drive to Survive had catapulted him into stardom.
Daniel Ricciardo!
Whatever you may think of Drive to Survive and how erroneously shithouse the editing and cooked narrative may be, it did help grow the popularity of the sport tremendously, and Honey Badger was an instant favorite with these newer fans. So again, he could earn some coin, and he knew it. But also, he wanted to be in a team that he could call his own, and so it was announced in August that for 2019, he would leave the Red Bull program behind, becoming his own man and joining the Renault team for whatever journey lay ahead. It was a ballsy move, especially given some of the problems with Renault PUs that he used that year, but hey, who am I to judge? Expectations surrounded his foray into the team about just how far he could take them. Some pundits, including former world champion and sentient clump of lard, Alan Jones, remarked that he expected Ricciardo to nab a podium in his first race with the team at Albert Park. It would only take 100 yards before that theory fell apart. It took a little while for Daniel to get fully bedded into the team. His engine nuking itself in Bahrain did kind of affect the power somewhat, but as each race drew on, he became more and more confident in that machinery. The machinery in question wasn't quite a Red Bull, and he did have to nail that concept into his head. His style of braking into the corners wasn't directly transferable from one to the other, but he clearly did have the measure of his teammate, Nico Hülkenberg. Thus, he was worth the check that his ass was demanding. Now, he did go without a win that year, which isn't something that he had much of since 2014, but momentum was on his side, and team principal Cyril Abiteboul had sold him a bill of goods. So he had supreme confidence that 2020 would herald yet more improvements, better results, and eventually the first win. He had a new teammate that year in the form of Esteban Ocon. He had spent a year outside of Formula 1, which was almost certainly going to hinder his performances, but that didn't mean diddly to Danny. He couldn't care less about his experience or whatever. People only care about how you stack up on paper, because the reality is that there is so much that we don't know and will never know that happens behind the scenes. So what goes out there in front of the world, that matters. And this year, for Ricciardo, it was no exception. Other than Sergio Perez at Racing Point, Danny Ric was arguably the best of all midfield runners that entire season, a constant presence in the points, and took 2 podiums at the Nürburgring and at Imola, with that Nürburgring performance being a particular standout. Granted, it did take virtually half the season before that Renault could be bothered turning up to work, but when it did, Ricciardo was dancing with it. Everything right now was trending in the right direction. He just looked so assured in that thing that really, there was no reason to leave, which made his decision earlier in the year to defect to McLaren for 2021 just that little bit strange. At that time, determining whether McLaren or Renault had more potential over the next few years was kind of 50-50. I know in hindsight that sounds ridiculous, but McLaren had made many promises in the years before this, and they hadn't gone back to the promised land like they said they would be. Stuff like the highly publicized failing of the Honda deal made many wonder if McLaren were even going to win it all again. On the other hand, Renault had Cyril, so pick your poison. Clearly, Danny liked what Zak Brown was plotting from his lair in his underground volcano, and thus put pen to paper to race for the Woking outfit in 2021. Now, with that team armed with Honey Badger to go along with the rising star in Lando Norris, it seemed that McLaren had a match made in heaven. But then, reality happened. For the vast majority of that year, Honey Badger drowned. Badly. He struggled to make sense of the McLaren's handling characteristics, especially under braking. Tracks with a high degree of slow corners were proving to be his kryptonite, with the car pushing on entry and compromising his exits. Then again, there were some tracks with slower corners where he was fine, and then there were some faster ones that he was slow on again. None of it was making any sense. The knock-on effects throughout the entire lap left him falling behind Lando, and questions began to arise as to what in the hell was happening to Daniel Ricciardo. I mean, he even started to wonder that too. Was it a setup thing, or was he washed? Every pro athlete has their decline. Was this the start of his? In a season where the pendulum swung between Red Bull and Mercedes, or more specifically Max and Lewis, the rest of the pack could only pick up the pieces. Literally, when these two titans came to blows in Monza, the seas parted for those behind. The Temple of Speed played to McLaren's strengths, and it played to Daniel's as well. For most of that race, the McLaren duo were line astern. After 53 laps, they crossed the line to take the checkered flag, and it was Daniel that crossed that line first. After months of struggles, questions over whether he still had it, he had made his retort. For those who thought he was gone, he never left. he just moved aside for a while. But as much as people wanted this to be a redemption story, it can't be one if this were to prove to be a one-off. And that's exactly what it proved to be. He fell back into the rut. Lando again was leaving him for dead. With the new regulations coming in 2022, it was kind of hoped that maybe this would breathe new life into his form. But it wasn't that either. If anything, it got worse. It wasn't just the lack of performance relative to Lando. There were also just strange mistakes that year that you just wouldn't expect from the guy. Not that everything was his fault. There were times where it was kind of obvious that McLaren was siding against him, such as in Baku, with the team, intentional or not, leaving him hung out to dry. Not that it made his lack of good performances any more acceptable. Rumors about McLaren was searching for other options for that second seat. The underperformance is just not acceptable to a team who have plans for world domination. With no viable options left, the sobering reality had set in. For the first time since the beginning of 2011, the Formula One grid would be without Daniel Ricciardo. He would end up being picked up by Red Bull as a test and reserve driver for 2023. It was almost comforting to see him back in the saddle at Red Bull, even if it wasn't a full-time seat. And maybe he wasn't expecting anything to pop up that year, but sooner than he might have thought, he was about to be thrown a lifeline. When Nick de Vries crashed and burned into the ground at AlphaTauri, Marco's buyer's remorse got the better of him and quickly searched for a replacement. After seeing Ricciardo's performance in a tyre test at Silverstone, which saw him run extremely close to Verstappen's times set in the previous weekend's British Grand Prix, Marco gave Ricciardo the heads up.
Quit your grinning and drop your linen, and pick up your helmet because your ass is racing in Spa.
Only a few months after initially thinking that he may have been out of Formula One entirely, he was now back into the thick of things, only to be out again when he injured himself at Zandvoort. He was momentarily replaced by Liam Lawson, although he would return for the US Grand Prix and continued on for the remainder of the year. How were his performances in that time? In general, pretty good. Well, better than de Vries was anyway, especially in Mexico, where he looked like $1 million, out-qualifying his teammate, but more importantly, out-qualifying Sergio Perez in that second Red Bull. And the importance of that is all the more crucial than you thought it was. When he returned to the AlphaTauri team for 2024, the ultimatum was clear. That second Red Bull seat could be his, if he proved himself. I mean, God forbid, an 8-time Grand Prix winner has to prove himself. As the season started, it became clear that, yeah, this ain't going the way that the script is saying. What the hell's going on? Sure, that Miami sprint was a nice performance, quintessential honey badger, but that was the one highlight amongst a myriad of poor ones. The objective was to basically leave teammate Yuki Tsunoda in the dust, but largely it was Yuki who had the better of him. As the year drew on, the results were improving, but not enough. Marco was losing patience, and unfortunately, the door had begun to close on that second Red Bull seat, and the team that he was in, despite what was said earlier in the year, was still regarded as a junior team. Having Daniel Ricciardo in there is just weird, especially when it seemed that he just wasn't adding to the team like they thought he would. And just like it was at McLaren, it seemed like the writing was on the walls. Days drew on, eventually turning into weeks. The atmosphere was becoming uncomfortable and everyone was hating it, in the paddock and at home. We all knew what was happening. We all knew what was to come. It all seemed to be not a matter of if, but a matter of when. On the eve of the Singapore Grand Prix, it was let known to Daniel that come the US Grand Prix, in just over a month's time, he wasn't going to be racing, that he would be replaced by Liam Lawson, who was told 2 weeks beforehand. But to Daniel, this was the first time he would hear about it. Why Red Bull elected not to tell him went beyond anyone's understanding, but I guess that's the Red Bull way. It's the same old story. One as old as time, as cliched as it gets, and it seemed to end like every other bloody story. To be dropped like this, direct, cold, callous, rancid. For now, however, there was still a race to be run, a time to take everything in and just remember you've made it this far. You've become an F1 driver. You've won here. You've got your legions of fans and you know why you've got them. Time to soak it all in. At the end of the race, in a Hail Mary effort, he bagged the fastest lap of the race. Even though he would not score a point, it was a way to leave his stamp. News was not official, but it was obvious. Not just by the rumors, but how he was after that race. The body language, not least the emotion he displayed in the interviews after the fact. He tried to put on a brave face for the cameras, but everyone could tell. Just a few days later, it was announced that his time in the team had come to an end. His Instagram post read almost like a farewell, not just from the team, but the sport as a whole. So what exactly led to the downfall of Daniel Ricciardo here? Well, in some ways he did it to himself. He just couldn't adapt to the handling characteristics of the McLaren, and he just never managed to recover from that point on. Did he reach his decline? I don't know. It's impossible to tell, but it's quite plausible that he did, that this just was his time. That is the nature of professional sport, as brutal as it is. We understand it, but it just sucks, because Daniel is and always has been a crowd favorite, well before the fame of Drive to Survive got to him. And it wasn't just because of his persona in the paddock, but what he did on the track, the last of the late breakers. A pure racer, a pure freaking racer, never shy from a battle, always willing to go for the nuts. Sure, we may see him surface in V8 supercars in his native Australia, and that would be great and all, but if this is how it all ends for Daniel Ricciardo in Formula 1, with the influence that he's had in and around the sport, at least he made his mark. One of his parting words was he'd hoped he'd left some amount of legacy in the sport. You did. Fuck yeah, you did.